Welcome everybody to a new attributed session brought to you by us at Dreamdata. Today is a session that I've been dreading a little bit because I know for a fact that I'm definitely not the smartest person in the room today because we've brought in two really smart people. And the reason why we've done that is that we want to try to talk a bit about marketing measurement today. As probably many of you marketers out there browse through LinkedIn, you probably see a lot of claims about marketing measurement. Some is definitely clearly snake oil, deliberately. Other things are kind of true, but not really true. And other things are true. But to kind of shake things up and investigate a little bit what's up and down in marketing measurement, we've brought in at least the two people I know in the world that knows the most about the math behind marketing measurement, which is Mikkel and Michael here, which I'll give the word to in a minute. And hopefully they can help educate me and you guys who are listening to get a bit smarter on the most commonly used marketing measurement frameworks, to find out where they should be applied, where they should not be applied, how much data do you need, what is the data actually telling us, and what do you actually benefit from doing marketing measurement in a good way. But Michael, for those who've never heard about you or Recast, kind of what's your story? How did you get into this very particular discipline, and what's Recast today?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me.
It's loud today.
Yeah, apologies. First of all, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here. A little bit about my background. So trained formally as an econometrician. So I came up through the academic world. I did a bunch of research in environmental economics, studying things like how households in Phoenix and Tucson, those are desert cities for those of you in Europe, react to changes in the price of water, right? So how can we understand that? From there, I moved into healthcare. I did a lot of comparative effectiveness studies and what's known as healthcare outcomes research. So really just looking at how can we look at data on different medical or healthcare interventions and how that changes, the outcomes that we can expect for certain populations of patients. The sort of most applied version of this is doing things like clinical trial studies. So I did some of that work as well as observational studies. And so really spent a lot of time thinking about how can we use observational data and still do valid causal inference. So that's really my background. And so all of the work that I do today is really based and rooted in this very academic and systematic approach to doing causal inference, where people's lives are on the line. And so it's a thing that I care deeply and I'm very passionate about. For the last 10 or 15 years, I've been taking all of those methods and ideas from that work in the academic world and in the world of healthcare and applying those to marketing science. So really thinking about how can we use all of those same methods that have been developed over many years in healthcare and formal academic causal inference and apply them to real business problems that a lot of companies face, specifically around how can we think about the best way to allocate our marketing dollars to really understand what's working and what's not in our business, and do it in a way that is valid. And really the only thing that I care about is that it really yields positive business outcomes for real businesses and real people. So that's my background. That's what I study. I'm also the co-founder and co-CEO of this company called Recast, We have built a marketing science platform, helps companies build what we call an incrementality system using experimentation and media mix modeling to do that process of optimization in a systematic way. But anyways, really excited to be here, and really great to get to chat about this topic I'm so passionate about.
Okay, that's great, Michael. And I think one of the things I admire about how you guys do marketing, when you read your website, you're also very deliberate about saying these are the people that should not contact us, because I suspect that's probably coming from what you're saying, that you can't predict that it's going to be a good outcome for people being a customer of yours, so you don't want to kind of take their money and leave them unhappy afterwards.
That's exactly right.
Cool. Mikkel, I know you quite well, but for those who have never met you before, kind of what is your background today in terms of what did you study, what did you work at before Dreamdata, and what are you doing at Dreamdata today?
Yeah, so I actually trained as a theoretical physicist. I have a PhD in theoretical physics. Then, was that now, more than 10 years ago, when leaving academia, ended up at a marketing consultancy platform, which have some similarities to Recast, at least in terms of doing MMMs and incrementality testing. Was there for a few years, then left for Dreamdata, where I'm now the VP of Data and AI for also been 4 years, a little bit more than 4 years I've been here. So a little bit unorthodox background in ending up in marketing analytics.
For both of you.
Yeah, maybe that's the...
It's fun. Michael, maybe let's start simple. So why are people asking questions about marketing measurement? What are people trying to solve? If we start with those, what are the things that people actually should be trying to solve when we talk about measuring marketing?
Yeah, so I think what are people actually trying to solve and what people should be trying to solve are probably different things in a lot of businesses, at least in my opinion. I'll maybe give the stylized answer for what I think is most important. So when I think about operating a business, and I am now a business operator, right? What I care about really is just optimizing the process of taking inputs and converting them into outputs. And one key input into my business and into a lot of businesses is marketing and sales activity, right? So how much effort are we putting into marketing? And effort, I'm using a vague term because effort can be things like planning events like we're doing right now. It can be things like writing and publishing content. And it can also obviously be denominated in dollars or euros or any other currency of paid media or paid advertising spend. And the relationship or the importance of that activity varies across different businesses. Some businesses don't really rely on marketing at all. And some businesses really, really, really rely on it. So sort of if you think about the ends of the spectrum here, like, I don't know, commodity goods suppliers don't do a lot of marketing. It's not that important for them. But like fast moving packaged goods, consumer goods do a lot of marketing. It's a hugely important part of their business. And so what these businesses are doing when we're talking about measuring marketing, it's really about, okay, for this activity that we are doing that is potentially very important for our business, is it as efficient as it could be, right? Is there ways that we can change how we are doing that, do more of it, do less of it, do different types of it in order to drive more profit at the end of the day? And so that is like, it almost sounds overly simplified when I talk about it that way, because a lot of people who are in the marketing measurement space are like impressions and share of voice and all of these other metrics. But I actually think that the right place to start is actually to step back and say, like, what are we doing at all? And really, what are we doing at all is trying to understand the business system that we have. What are the inputs? Marketing activity, marketing effort. And then what are the outputs, right? Some version of profit for most organizations. And so really when we talk about marketing measurement, or when I talk about it, what I am thinking about is how are we understanding that relationship so that we can optimize it and get more profit for less effort over time.
I love that definition. Hopefully a lot of people listening here today agree that it's about money are hard made, and when you spend money on different kind of go-to-market activities, you should be seeking to get the most out of the money you spend on these activities. If we start to take some steps into kind of what are the most used methods, I did some research. I did ask ChatGPT, and I think there's 3 methods that came out as the most used, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. The one thing would be to do the MMM, marketing mix modeling. The other one would be incrementality studies, and the last one being attribution. And I thought it could be good to really explain to people what are these different methods, because we want to avoid people kind of saying one thing and then the reality is something completely different. So by the words of Michael's website, let's get it scientifically rigor what we talk about. Mikkel, I know you have a lot of experience with the MMM as well. So marketing mix modeling. If you were to explain what it is that Recast do today, you don't have to know their specific product, but what's MMM about?
So I think MMM, if you sort of take, starting from what Michael said, is about, you start with some inputs, and that's the strong part of MMM, that those inputs can be quite broadly defined. Normally you call them predictors or variables. Then you look at how well do they correlate to some outcome, and that's what Michael talks about. That's do you care about? Do you care about signups? Do you care about money in the bank? Do you care about meetings, books, etc.? And then it's basically the art of the science is to figure out a way to model those predictors, those efforts, into how they correlate with your outcome. So and the ultimate goal of this is obviously, if I now have a model that tells me if I increase this effort by a certain percent, how much outcome do I get? Is that did I do it somewhat justice, Michael? Without the part of the product, obviously.
I think that's mostly right. I sort of describe it a little bit differently. And there's one thing that I want to note. So, Stefan, you use the word incrementality studies, and I actually don't love that terminology, because when I think about what are we doing marketing measurement at all, everything that I was just describing is we're trying to measure incrementality. And so everything that we should be doing, we should always be thinking about how well does this approximate incrementality or causality. And so a media mix model, I think done correctly, should be attempting to learn incrementality. It is an incrementality study. Experimentation is another way of trying to learn about incrementality. They have pros and cons depending on how the experiment is set up. And even touch-based attribution, right? The theory is that in at least some cases, we hope that it is close to measuring incrementality. And so I never use the word incrementality studies, because everything that we should be doing in marketing should be trying to ascertain incrementality. We have different ways of approaching that. So that's point one. When we talk about MMM, the way that I describe it is it's top-down econometric modeling. And so I like to really emphasize this word top-down, which was, I think, definitely what Mikkel said, but this is for people who are newer to the space. This is really the most important difference, is that you are looking at aggregate data and using statistical models on aggregate data to find patterns in that data. That's really what MMM is all about. And so the key difference between media mix modeling and even experimentation and something that might be more familiar, like a touch-based attribution modeling, is going to be that it's using aggregate data. There's no individual level information at all in general going into that model. So there's nothing about what Michael saw and then Michael clicked on and then Michael did on the path to conversion. That's just not information that's included at all. It's all like 100 people did this thing, and that is what is going into the model. And so that is really the biggest difference.
I think that's kind of, as a marketer, that's one of the things I struggle a little bit with understanding. Where's the input that MMM gives me then? Because if it is kind of, there's something in the sheet that says Facebook, and then there's another one that says TV, and there's another one who says revenue. Oh, sorry, radio, or some. I'm just giving simple examples here. But if I get it at that higher level, what does that tell me? Or how do I then use the MMM analysis to proceed with my work? That's probably something you meet often, Michael.
Yes, although I guess I don't imagine, like, if you were looking at an individual level and you just say, Steven heard a radio ad before converting, that also doesn't tell you very much to do. So when we're making decisions, we're always looking at the aggregate level.
Yeah.
So I think, again, if you know what the cost per acquisition or the cost per event or the incremental return on investment of investment into different marketing activity is, sometimes people tell me that they don't know what to do with that, and that blows my mind, because for me it's very obvious. Like, you should change your marketing budget so that you have the optimal mix, such that you're optimizing some profit function. So I mean, I would say, like, take money out of the lower performing channels and put money into the higher performing channels. But again, that should be true of any measurement method that you're using. Again, assuming that you believe that they are approximating true incrementality. If you believe that you are approximating true incrementality, what to do with the results is very straightforward. The answer is always reallocate your marketing budget or your efforts in order to, you know, put more effort into the things that are working well and less effort into the things that are not working well.
Absolutely. And I guess what are the so Mikkel said you can put in a lot of different components into the MMM analysis. What's typically in your customers, Michael? What kind of things typically goes into the list of things they want to have more knowledge about, whether it works or not?
So I think the things to focus on in general, when you're doing this sort of statistical analysis, my recommendation is to focus on the things that you have control over, which is to say the things that you can change, because what you want to be doing is learning about what are the levers that I have to control. There are lots of potentially interesting academic studies that one could do about all kinds of different things that might impact a business. But if the business doesn't have control over those things, if there's no action to take, then those learnings aren't actually that useful. Right? They might be like intellectually stimulating, like, oh, isn't it interesting that, you know, I don't know, when it's El Nino season, you know, our business is different. Like, yes, that's interesting, but there's nothing you can really do about that. And so I generally recommend that when businesses are approaching any type of statistical modeling or any type of analysis, really, that they focus on what are the levers that you have. And even before you do the analysis, think about what are you going to change about your business as a result of this analysis. Keeping the focus there really simplifies things, because in the world of statistical modeling, statistical modelers often use the word parsimony, which is to say that they prefer a parsimonious model, which generally means that simpler models are better. And the reason why that is because there's less chances for things to go wrong. The more complex a model is, the more chances there are for it to be wrong in subtle but important ways. And so simpler models are generally better. And so when people ask me, like, you know, sometimes people are like, oh, media mix modeling, we have to control for every possible thing in the world. What about the temperature and, you know, the number of cars on the street? And I'm like, don't do any of that. Like, that is just other ways for the model to go wrong. Instead, you want to focus on the things that you have control over, which generally is going to be something like your marketing activity, right? And so most of the time, that's like your paid media. Sometimes it can be other non-paid marketing activity. That could be events. It could be things like CRM activity, depending on exactly what you're trying to model. But in general, my recommendation is to really try to focus on what are the things that your business has control over, because those are the levers that you are going to pull to actually drive the business forward.
Super nice. Really good explanation, Michael. Another thing that I think that is quite interesting to learn about is the time period you can study using the different kind of marketing measurement methods. And when we do MMM, Mikkel, then how long between your activity and the outcome are you typically observing? Is it a week, a month, a year, or how? Where is it, what's the space where it's fair to make predictions when you're using a method like MMM?
So fair making predictions is always sort of let's say how well does the model perform? Is it able to actually predict anything? Obviously, you can sort of aggregate the models a little bit different. So if you aggregate everything to a month, then the time periods can also be sort of feel longer. Obviously, you also typically need more months to make that actually work compared to if you do days. The places where I've seen it work the best are when there's a relatively short period between what you're doing and the outcome you're measuring. So people can do something rather immediately. Where I had an example from my previous job where we tried to model one of the big car dealerships in Europe. That's hard because people don't sort of all of a whim ask, oh, I want to buy a car because I saw an ad. It's a very long decision. That makes it hard to get right. Whereas the one where the sort of cycle is shorter is typically easier, which makes some of the e-commerce applications better, because you don't have a huge amount of time between what you did and the effect that you're looking for. And in boilerplate, you could say the amount of things that can happen between you do something and the outcome you're looking for. The more things that happens in between, the more variables you would need to get that right.
Oh yeah.
So depending a little bit on your business, some businesses are more stable, so you don't do a lot of different things, and some businesses are very dynamic, so you do 1,000 things at the same time. And if you do 1,000 things at the same time, you need a shorter period.
Yeah, that makes sense. Michael, who your customers, what are the types of products that they have that has probably, can you talk about product to MMM fit in some way? Like where is it a really good tool, and a bit like Mikkel says, car dealership is probably a bit of the too slow moving.
So a lot of car companies are famous for using media mix modeling. So I wouldn't necessarily actually say that, consumer durables are impossible to model. So I wouldn't necessarily rule those out.
No.
When I think about, so there's a couple of different dimensions as to we think who is this approach a good fit for? And one of the dimensions is like modeling power, let's call it. So in the terms of statistical power. But another dimension is like, is it worth it? And it's actually like, those are sort of two different dimensions, and it's important to think about both. So in general, the is it worth it dimension is often more important. And so is it worth it often has to do with what's the total amount of marketing investment that you're making. If you're only spending a couple $100,000 a year, or even a couple $100,000 a month on marketing, MMM is really complex. It's really hard. It's probably not going to be worth it for you, right? Like, just because the amount that you're going to have to invest in building a good model and evaluating it and testing it often isn't going to be worth it for you. And so I talk to a lot of smaller businesses. They advertise in 1 or 2 marketing channels. They have relatively limited marketing budgets. And we could build a very sort of quote unquote good statistical model for you, but it's going to be expensive, and you're not going to get that much additional signal beyond what you might get from other sources. And so that's the first question to answer when you're thinking about fitness for this type of modeling activity. The other dimension is on the statistical modeling side. And I think Mikkel did a good job of explaining some of the issues. I'll maybe restate in different words some of what he said. One big problem, well, sort of maybe just like the challenge as a whole of media mix modeling, is that we're working with aggregate data. And so it's generally a fairly limited data set. So if you imagine even daily data, right, for the last 2 or 3 years, you're talking about between 700 and 1,000 rows of data. It's just not a lot of data when it comes to trying to answer the fairly complex statistical questions that we have. And so we have a limited amount of data, and the problem of the media mix model is to try to extract signal from that limited amount of data. And the amount of total signal in the data is basically going to be determined by the strength of the connection or the strength of the correlation between marketing activity on one side and the business outcome on the other. And so the tighter that connection is, the stronger that naive correlation is in the data, the more signal there is for the model to harvest. And so, as Mikkel mentioned, when the outcome is closer in time and sort of more directly connected to the marketing activity, the easier it is for the model to find that connection, right? Because that correlation will just naturally be stronger in the data. The looser that connection is, so either the lower impact that marketing has or the more the marketing impact is spread out in time, the harder it is for the model to find that connection because the correlations are necessarily weaker, right? If you imagine a business where, on average, the time between marketing activity and a purchase or the business event is like 6 months, but like spread out, it could be anything between 1 month and 18 months. That's a really long time. And there's effectively ends up being no signal in the underlying data because that connection is so loose and so dispersed. And so a top-down statistical model like a media mix model and econometric method is going to have a very hard time finding that relationship. And so that's the core problem. It's not like it's hard to give like an easy rule of thumb and say like these businesses yes, these businesses no, because it's all on a spectrum. But that's a good way, I think, to think about it is like the more tightly connected the marketing activity is to the event of interest, the easier it will be to build a statistical model. And then on the other side of the spectrum, the looser that connection is, the harder it is to build a good statistical model.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
It's also one of the things that make sort of when you see marketing mix models usually stop at the sort of channel type level. That is usually the reason, because the more you break it down, the more variables you get per day, which is one of those where that's why I love your marketing material so much, Michael. This part of that you need to get it right. It's not that you can't make a model with where every campaign is in. It's definitely possible. It will just not be
easy. In fact, it's very easy to do.
This is a good model, and the outcome you will get out from it will most likely be wrong because you have put too many variables in to something where now you're just getting noise out. That's where there's from people trying to do it that from the outside makes it hard. There you actually need to be pretty rigorous about testing it and making sure that it actually works.
I think, Mikkel, this is a really astute point. And it's something that people that are new to this field, it can sometimes, it's not super obvious to them, right? Because if you think, oh, the media mix model is a black box algorithm where you just shove data in and get data out on the other side, and it works, you might imagine that it works something like a touch-based attribution algorithm, right? Okay, we're doing last touch attribution, we just shove more data in, we get stuff out on the other side. Media mix modeling does not work that way. And it is mechanically simple to build a media mix model. Anyone that is listening to this could build a media mix model in Excel or Google Sheets. It'll take you about 20 minutes. Won't be hard. You can put in as many channels as you want. You will get results on the other side. Oftentimes the fit of the model, I'll put that in scare quotes, the fit of the model will actually even be pretty good, but the results will be totally wrong. If you follow the advice or the implied advice of those results, you will waste a ton of money. It will be terrible. Same thing is true with any of the open source tools. Very easy to run a model. Trivially easy, in fact. Again, it just doesn't take very much work. The problem is that these are econometric methods that are trying to do causal inference about unknown parameters. And so they are non-deterministic, and it is very difficult to know if you got it right or not. And that is the problem. And so while mechanically it's very easy to do these things, just add more channels, just run the model. What actually is hard is the validation of these methods. And that is what the problem is. And so unlike a deterministic algorithm like last touch attribution or first touch attribution, where again, you can just sort of like, there is no uncertainty, there is no probability in that estimate. With a media mix model, we are trying to infer something that is unknown and unobservable, and that is very challenging to do because you cannot validate it. And that is the key problem. And I think a lot of people that, again, are new to this world don't necessarily fully grasp that. you could have, again, it is very, very easy to run a media mix model. So you should all do that. If you're interested in using a media mix model, you should do it yourself. Do it in Excel, see what the results are. Again, because it's easy. That hopefully will get you to start to think about, that's not the hard part. That's not what we should be thinking about if we're going to go down this path. What we need to be thinking about is how are we going to validate it? How are we going to know that it's actually right and that it can be trusted? And that is the thing that is the hard part.
Ooh, that's a good cliffhanger, Michael. So what work can people do then to validate their models? Because I assume the model is something, I'm seeing a spreadsheet in front of me where you have channels, and then you have some revenue coming out on the other side, and then you try to predict the influence of the different kind of activities. But getting the estimate to fit with, or like validate, as you say, against the result, what's the secret sauce there?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a challenge. But so the first thing to get clear on is, what are we trying to do? And this will harken back to the beginning of this call where we talked about what are we trying to do here at all, as in the field of marketing measurement or the field of marketing science. And that's, in my opinion, understand incrementality. If we invest another $1,000 in some marketing channel, how much additional revenue or additional profit or additional conversions is that going to drive for us? That's the whole point. And so when we're thinking about validating the marketing mix model, there are sort of two different things to think about. So the first and most important is what I would call external validation, which is to say the model is going to be going to making effectively predictions, right, about if we make some change, what is going to happen. Those are falsifiable predictions that we should be able to think about how to test. And so the most important way to validate a marketing mix model is thinking about, how do we test those falsifiable hypotheses or falsifiable predictions that the model is making. And that is going to require activity from us. You cannot just do this in the lab. And so if you are thinking about going down this world, what you should be thinking about before you start building your own marketing mix model or engaging a vendor is, how are we going to test and validate it? I'll talk a little bit about ways to validate it in just a second, but I do want to quickly comment on internal validation methods. So this is like internal to the model itself. Is it working? There are a couple of things that you can do to check this, but those always need to be subsumed under external validation methods. The problem is, especially with very complex models like a marketing mix model, is that internal measures like goodness of fit. So, you might have heard of root mean squared error or MAPE, mean absolute percentage error. These are measures of like, how well does a model fit the data? Those aren't very useful in this context because the models are so powerful. They almost always have very good internal measures of fit. This is what I mean is, if you do this yourself in Excel, you can probably get to a model that has really good internal fit, really good root mean squared error, or really good MAPE. But that doesn't mean that the inferences about the performance of the different marketing channels are actually accurate. So there's a bunch of things that you can do to check internal accuracy. Those are important, but those always need to be, they cannot replace the external validation methods that you need to do. So, okay, we run the media mix model, we get some results. It's going to say things like, I don't know, Facebook has an incremental return on investment of 5x, and TV has an incremental return on investment of 10x, and radio has an incremental return of investment on 3x. That's interesting. And now we need to start to think about, okay, could that possibly be true, right? Do we have evidence to support that?
Yeah.
And there's different ways to do that. And one is by doing, or really all of them are going to involve some amount of experimentation or quasi-experimentation. So you can do things like geographic holdout studies, where you take some marketing channel and you turn it on or turn it off in certain geographies, and you compare before and after the experiment, what was the lift or the decline in profit associated with that change, and then you want to compare that to your media mix model results. You can also do things like, making broader changes that aren't necessarily controlled experiments. We're just going to turn off branded search, and the model is going to make a prediction about how much our revenue is going to change if we turn off branded search, and we want to see, is the results that we actually see after making that change consistent with what the model predicted? You can also use you can start to hone in on whether or not the model's predictions are consistent with other data points, even using things like post-checkout surveys. Like you can start to back into different ways of, is this consistent at all? But I generally recommend starting with different types of experimental or quasi-experimental methods to check for consistency between those results and what the media mix model would be predicting or recommending.
That's so cool. And but while you're talking, I was reflecting a little bit about. I guess it's fair to say that like MMM is typically a B2C e-com kind of method. And we're
not say that. So first of all, I would not say that. Especially, so if you think about the history of media mix modeling, it was invented long before the internet, or not. I mean, it depends on when you define the invention of the internet, but long before the modern internet, right? Media mix modeling has been around since the 1970s. Some people date it to even earlier than that. So it cannot be a tool just for D2C and e-com because it long predates D2C and e-com. So I don't think that is like a fair characterization at all.
That's fair. That's fair. What I had in mind was kind of for the B2B world, where kind of like our benchmarks looks like customer journeys are more than 200 days. So the model's ability to predict an adjustment and then 200 days later is probably a stretch. But if you're in B2B, maybe you have there's a proxy metric like amount of leads that submits a form on your website that might be what you can measure instead. Could that be a fair statement then, Michael?
Yeah, so I think it depends. There's lots of B2B businesses that use media mix modeling very productively. They tend to be more SMB oriented, right? So they are more selling to smaller businesses, and therefore, they look a little bit more like consumer advertisement. So we can sort of think about the world of marketers on a spectrum of like pure consumer, fast moving consumer goods on one end, and then maybe a little bit further over would be things like prosumer, right? And so this might be like tools for individuals, maybe they're using for work, maybe they're running their small business, and then you have like true small business. And so this could include things like, I don't know, small business, HR software, payments services, right? All of those things. Those are all, I think, can very naturally and easily use tools like media mix models. Further on the spectrum is like more enterprise sales, right? And those tend to be, very sales driven. They tend to not have like a product-led growth method, right? It's like you submit a lead, you talk to someone, you talk to more people, you have more conversations. Those are a lot harder to do on media mix modeling. And so when we talk about B2B, it really depends on where on that spectrum you are. The further you are to like high volume sales, product-led growth, the easier something like a media mix model, or the better that it's potentially going to work for you. To your other question about using an intermediate variable, I think that makes sense. So something like marketing qualified leads, total leads, sales qualified leads, whatever you want to call them, or whatever metric is important, that can work. But again, the volume of those leads actually matters. And so if you're like a true enterprise sales business and you're like, if we get 15 leads a week, that's an amazing week for us. There's just not going to be a lot of variation in that data that a media mix model is going to be able to harvest. If you're getting hundreds or thousands of leads a week, then maybe yes. And so it really just depends on what that volume looks like as to whether or not a top-down statistical model is going to be able to even plausibly pick up any signal.
Makes a lot of sense. I think we promised to talk about attribution and multi-touch attribution, so it's time to put Mikkel under pressure. But I just want Steve Cosell is asking a good question here in the chat, so I'll pull it up for you. Do you recommend modeling off a historical period that holds out the most recent period and then use that period to validate the model? I.e. model off, I'll just read the last sentence, then I'll let you talk, Michael. I.e. model off data from time periods 1 to 4 and then see how well it actually predicts what happens in period 5.
I'll answer. Great question. I'm so glad you asked it. Yes, I do recommend that. I think that this is a very, very important check for modeling, especially, again, sort of assuming you're doing this at the beginning modeling phase. Yes, you should absolutely do this. And one of the, when we talk about what Recast does as a company, one of the things that we have done is really engineered a lot of the tools that make doing this easy and seamless as part of the model building process. Again, running an open source modeling library like Meridian or Facebook's Robin are very easy. What is harder is actually building all of the infrastructure that makes doing these tests possible. So anyways, we highly recommend this. We actually recommend doing this a lot. So Steve, I would say, do this a bunch of different times. Run it, train it through period 1, and then predict the next 3, and then train it through period 2 and predict the next 3, and then train it through period 3 and then predict the next 3. And so really you want to do this a lot in order to understand if the model is consistently working over time. And then beyond that, you actually want to do that into the future. So once you train the model through data today, we want to check back in next month and see how the model did. And then the following month, we want to check back in and see how the model did, and do that continuously over time in order to be continuously validating the model, as opposed to just like treating it like it's a one-shot activity. We think that the modeling exercise and evaluation process should be done continuously over time and treated as an ongoing tool, as opposed to a thing that you are just doing one time and saying, yes, the holdout make looks good, we're going to use this model forever. Instead, you want to be thinking about it continuously validating it.
Super nice, Michael. Mikkel, if we then switch to let Michael be brief a little bit, then multi-touch attribution as opposed to MMM. Could you maybe describe what that is? What is the math? What is the engineering that you help our customers look at?
Yeah, so maybe starting with when Michael started saying MMM is a top-down method, then MTA would probably be what you'll call a bottom-up method, where you sort of start with exactly what the MMM has aggregated away, namely the individual touches or journeys. Obviously, that has the limitation of what can you actually need some kind of touch in it. Or if you want to have the type of impression type data, you need to be very careful in not mixing that with a click, because all of a sudden you have two things that are very, very dissimilar. So if you just throw everything into let's just give 1% to every touch point of the hundreds that I have, if half of them are impressions, that will go very wrong. So I think that the big difference with these two are the ones that sort of the granularity and the data set you actually start with. In that sense, you can say the MTA data is, at least to some degree, harder to acquire, because it actually requires a lot more effort to sort of figure out what did individual people do. They signed up for this. Do I have them tracked to whatever buying entity they are part of, compared to just getting what amount of spend did I spend on Google. Then obviously you have sort of different types of MTA, where you will see the basic ones, the ones that goes just above first touch, last touch, is where you sort of start picking out points in that journey and giving them some kind of credit. I usually refer to that as sort of it's a little bit more bookkeeping than statistical correlation. Hopefully the aim is obviously that the bookkeeping sort of mimics correlation, but in that sense it is bookkeeping. You're getting scoring about the journey that you've collected. Then when you then start applying sort of a little bit more data-driven approaches, then you start to look for correlations in those journeys. What did people do, the ones that ended up being a successful purchase? So you get closer to sort of it is still a correlation method, but obviously you hope that the correlation, at least to some degree, reflects causation. And then obviously you are in the same, once you have those methods, you are in the same boat as Michael described before, then testing whether or not those methods, is it actually correct that the model found that this channel or this activity correlates very well with winning more deals or closing more customers.
Yeah, and as opposed to MMM that is at a channel level, I suppose when you're collecting all the data yourself, you can also control whether you collect campaign names and keyword names or webinar names as well, right?
Yeah, it is in that sense more, since you're collecting very granular information, you usually have a more granular approach to what did happen, because you have less of the aggregate variable problem that Michael has doing MMMs. So it's easier in that sense to get the granular approach. What you're usually losing is the close-up part to causality.
And how much, and that's for both of you, kind of, how much I think a lot of people are like questioning themselves whether do we actually have enough data to use these methods. What can we guide? I know with you guys don't like rule of thumbs too much because you want specifics, but some kind of rule of thumb for like how big or how much should people spend to actually have enough data to run the two methods. Mikkel, what's your experience with our customers? How much data or spend or stuff like that do people need to start looking at multi-touch attribution?
Yeah, so multi-touch, this is usually why people have a tendency to start there, is that you actually don't need that much to start getting some useful information out of it. The problem is obviously you don't get the same, if you have very few, you also don't get the sort of the full picture, but you still get the information you can actually act on. Then maybe you cannot act on everything in your entire business, but you can start small. That's what makes it easier. I would usually not say that spend is the big issue. It's the same with MMMs. It's not the amount of spend. It's not like you need to go for a certain threshold. It's more that's where Michael said before, is it worth it? Because I mean, if you only spend very, very little and you can gain, let's say you can gain 10%, then the amount of effort that you spent gaining those 10% has to be lower than what you're actually saving.
Makes a lot of sense. What about Michael? I know your website has a lot of guidance for how much people spend. So maybe you share a few of those data points.
I mean, it really varies a lot. I think, just commenting on or extending maybe what we were just talking about with respect to different types of attribution measurements and when they're valuable. Like my thought on what I would call touch-based attribution or just digital tracking is that it's great, and you should have some set up to do some amount of it as soon as you are doing any amount of marketing. But you should be very thoughtful about how you are interpreting the data and what you are doing with it. And I think that is the place where people actually start to go wrong. Like, I highly recommend that people look at digital tracking based reports all of the time. What was our first touch cost per acquisition? What's our last touch cost per acquisition? If you want to do some multi-touch on there, fine. I look at that all of the time for our business. Like, we are often looking at what are people clicking on and engaging with prior to submitting a lead and eventually converting. But we don't look at it that closely. And so really, like, what I am looking at as we have a decent sized business at this point. We have a lot of leads coming in. We have a decent amount of marketing spend. What matters to us is more like the broad trends. When we start to do this new thing X, do we see more leads coming in? Do we hear more people mentioning certain marketing channels? And I'm not looking for like a very precise cost per lead number. And we get a cost per lead number from like our search campaigns and our LinkedIn campaigns and our YouTube campaigns. But we don't look closely at those. Like, those I do not think are very useful. What I do think is useful is looking at the broad trends, and overall, does it seem like this could possibly be profitable for us? Is it moving in the right direction? And so, especially for smaller businesses, I think I see this problem where people try to overread into it, and they're like, okay, the touch-based attribution model says cost per lead on LinkedIn is 75 and cost per lead on Google search is 40. So we're turning off LinkedIn and going all in on search. And I'm like, that's not right. Like probably not. It might be right. It's probably not right. And so I think what you want to make sure that you're doing is not overusing the data or believing that they're more precise than they actually are. The readout of a touch-based attribution model often doesn't come with any uncertainty, right? Because it's a deterministic calculation. You just add up the numbers and you divide them and you get one number at the end. But the thing that people forget is that the thing that we care about is incrementality, right? And the touch-based attribution model is not measuring incrementality. It is approximating incrementality, and it's that approximation that should come with uncertainty. And so as a small business owner or even a medium-sized business owner, you need to be thinking about that piece of it. The $70 cost per lead for LinkedIn and the $40 cost per lead for Google are not uncertain in how they are calculated, but they are very uncertain in their approximation of the thing that we care about, which is the causal relationship between that marketing activity and what it's actually driving. And so just to sum it up and restate that, I think what you want to be doing is be very thoughtful about not being too precise and treating those things as just facts, but rather inputs into a larger decision-making process that needs to take into account that underlying uncertainty.
I think that's pretty much how I think about any kind of marketing measurement, is this kind of, if you think about normal distribution, and there's certain parts of your marketing that are, with these, both your tool and our tool helps you see this is not working or it's highly inefficient. And then there's other of the activities that we do that are very effective. And if we can just continuously over time shift the budget from the things that we can somewhat prove see that it doesn't work or it does work, and move that budget in the right direction, then we will as a business get better and better and more effective in our go-to-market. One of the promises we made to the listeners as well was kind of trying to talk a little bit about the difference in marketing measurement for B2B and B2C. Mikkel, you have kind of done the switch like from fully B2C to fully B2B. What's been kind of some of the, I don't know if you want to call them aha moments, or some of the most important things that people should think about as they think about marketing measurement in a B2C context or in a B2B context?
I think when switching from one to another, I think the thing that sort of strikes you the most is the way some of the marketing channels work, where B2B are a lot more sort of direct face-to-face type of thing. I think that might also be one of the reasons why people start with the MTA type of thing, is that in B2B, you almost have to collect some of that data anyway, because if you can only sell by a salesperson reaching out to you, talking to you, you kind of need to know that person's email. Otherwise, how are you getting hold of the person? Where in a lot of B2C context, you can actually have a relationship with somebody that haven't logged in or haven't done, that you actually don't know face to face. So I think that was the sort of the biggest differentiator. And I think some of it is also the length, the different steps you go through, where in B2C, it's a lot easier to find okay, I care about this number. It's the revenue number. And then that's the thing I'm modeling for. When B2B, it's sort of, I almost go too far that in a lot of our customers, if they called up Michael and the first thing he said, oh, we model to your closed won business, they should run screaming, because now he doesn't know what he's talking about. So there's different sort of steps that you need to find something else to model for certain methods to actually work. Where some of that becomes more natural and are more, you could say, textbook-like in a B2C context.
And if you talk about attribution in B2B, we're also not just trying to follow that one path of one individual. It's pretty often a buying group of 6 or 8 people that needs to make a decision. So even though somebody starts the research on the journey, it might be the CEO or CFO who signs the contract. And if those two dots are not in any way connected, it's hard to understand how the journey develops.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. We're pretty close to the end here. I want to allow you, each of you, kind of to just kind of try to recap what's probably, in your opinion, the most important thing that people should take away for this discussion that could last for weeks, or it has lasted for 100 years about about marketing measurement. What is the most kind of sound advice that people should think about as they kind of start doing marketing measurements again tomorrow? Michael, what would your best advice be?
I mean, my best advice is to be skeptical of everything. Always be asking yourself, how is this measurement misleading me? And I'm not even saying if this measurement is misleading you, because it is. It always is. And you need to be thinking about how is it misleading you, to what degree, and what you're going to do about that. And I think if you keep your focus on that with this very scientific, skeptical approach, that is going to prevent you from making most of the big mistakes that I have seen people make. So anytime you're looking at any number, whether it's in in an advertising platform, in some vendor's tool, in your own analyst's report, you should always be thinking about, how are these numbers misleading us? They always will be to some degree. You can't get away from that. So sorry, that's unfortunate, but that's the world that we live in. You can't get away from that. And so you just want to always keep that in the back of your mind. And as long as you're doing that, and then you can start to think about this, this measurement X is misleading us in Y direction, and measurement, other measurement is misleading us in a slightly different direction. Maybe between them is the truth. That is a good way to start thinking about understanding marketing measurement and actually really being able to use the tools and the outputs in a way that's productive. And so that is where I would, that is my sort of maybe closing advice for all of you, is to be as skeptical as possible and then experiment more, right? Just because we are uncertain about things doesn't mean that we can't make changes and then evaluate the impact of those changes. So always be doing that. So be very skeptical, experiment more. The more that you're doing that, I think the better off you will be.
That's great. I still remember one week in my old job, the Facebook pixel fired twice every time we had one one conversion on the web shop. So I really loved that week because sales was just going mental, but all it was actually just the Facebook pixel firing twice. So be very skeptical about numbers you look at. Mikkel, what's your best advice for people getting into marketing measurement? What should they remember?
Yeah, I really liked Michael's sort of the skeptical part, and I would probably add to it in the sense that, because these skeptical about things can end you in a camp where now I'm too afraid to do anything because nothing is true. So this thing over here, I can't trust it anything. This thing over here, you can't trust that either. It's not the true incrementality. So now I end up doing nothing. Where it's sort of being aware of what each model has, or each method has its own limitations and pros and cons, but all of them have something where you can sort of, okay, what action could I actually take from this? So if I figure out that all of my leads are doing this, then, okay, then let me try to do more of that. Let me try to see this. Then compare it with the skeptical part that it's sometimes you get all of them are doing something. Yeah, well, that's because you forced all of them to do something. Or the good example, oh, all of my leads have seen my my LinkedIn ads. Yeah, well, that's how you set up your LinkedIn ads. You've set it up so that every lead will see them. So, I mean, that looks great if you do a sort of a quasi lift test. It just doesn't say anything about incrementality at all. But that doesn't mean that you should just scrap it, or so that there's still the part of figuring out what can you actually do with these different methods. Are there any signals in this that lets you act on something to improve your business. Because all models have something where you can use them to some kind of action.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think people know where to get a hold of Mikkel and Michael, but if people wanna reach out to you, talk more with you, talk with Recast, what should they do?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is I'm very active on LinkedIn. So you can follow me, Michael Kaminsky, on LinkedIn. Love talking about marketing measurement topics. And then otherwise, check out our website, getrecast.com. There's a ton of educational content. We have an amazing blog. Check that out. And there's a bunch of forums to be able to get in contact with me and the team on there. And we'll be looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you. That's great. Everyone who's listening, who's watching, thank you so much for spending the time with us. If you like the conversation, there's a show called Attributed where you listen to podcasts. There's more than 200 conversations with other very smart go-to-market people, so go check that out. Mikkel and Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to try and educate people a little bit more. And everyone, I wish you a great day.